I think most of us have this very static image when we think about the New Testament.
Hmm.
You picture this leather-bound book, maybe with gold leaf pages, just sitting on a shelf. It feels finished. It feels like it dropped out of the sky, completely assembled.
Right. As a single unified thing?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you actually peel back the layers and look at the history of how these texts came to be, you don't find a static book at all. You find, well, it's more like a crime scene.
That is a very dramatic way to put it, but
Mm.
honestly, you aren't wrong. It is a literary crime scene that scholars have been dusting for fingerprints on for the last 300 years.
And that is exactly what we are doing today. We are jumping into a deep dive on what is known as the synoptic problem.
Mm-hmm.
We're looking at the first three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the headline here isn't just that they tell the story of Jesus. It's that when you put them side by side, something very, very suspicious starts to emerge.
Suspicious is the right word, because we aren't talking about three people just, remembering the same event in their own unique ways.
No.
We are talking about identical sentence structures. We are talking about specific, unique Greek words appearing in the exact same order across different books.
Now let's put this in modern terms. If I'm a university professor and three students turn in these three Gospels as essays, what am I doing?
Oh, you're calling them into your office for plagiarism immediately.
Right.
You'd be holding up the paper saying you clearly copied off each other.
Okay, so the mission for this deep dive is to unpack this puzzle. We've got a stack of historical analysis, linguistic studies here, and we need to figure out who wrote what first, who copied whom, and why, in the end, did this early movement decide it needed three different versions of basically the same biography.
And that why is fascinating because it tells us less about the books and more about the people who needed them. It's a story about survival, about politics, and a really radical shift in how people viewed the world.
Let's start with the terminology, just to make sure everyone is on the same page. We keep saying synoptic. That sounds like a brand of contact lenses or something.
It does. It comes from the Greek. Syn means together, and opsis means view or seeing, like optical.
Ah, so synoptic literally means viewing together.
Exactly.
Which makes sense because Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they basically cover the same timeline. They see the story from the same angle, unlike the fourth one, John.
Right. John is the total outlier. If the synoptics are a documentary crew on the ground, capturing the grit and the timeline,
Yeah.
John is like a philosophical voiceover added 50 years later, totally different style, different content, different theology. You can't line John up in parallel columns with the others. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're a family.
A very dysfunctional family, maybe. So let's look at the evidence. The source material highlights this synoptic problem. This is the core detective story.
It is.
When you look at the raw Greek text, the similarities they're just statistically impossible to be a coincidence.
It is uncanny. Here's the breakdown. Almost the entire Gospel of Mark is contained inside Matthew. It's something like 90% of the verses.
90%.
And a massive chunk of Mark is also inside Luke.
So naturally, the first question scholars asked was the chicken and egg question. Who was the original? For a long time, the church tradition was that Matthew wrote first, right?
That was the assumption for centuries. I mean, it made sense. Matthew was the tax collector, one of the 12 disciples. He seemed the most qualified, an eyewitness.
But in the modern era, once scholars started doing real forensic linguistic analysis, the arrow of time flipped.
It flipped completely.
And this is where we get the concept of Markan priority.
Exactly. The consensus now, and it's a really strong consensus, is that Mark is the original source. And the reason comes down to editing logic.
Okay, walk us through that. Because usually you'd assume the longer, more detailed book comes first, and then someone summarizes it later, like a Reader's Digest version.
You'd think so. But look at the quality of the writing. Mark's Greek is, well, it's rough.
Yeah.
It's street Greek, it's grammatically awkward, sentences run on, and the whole thing feels very hurried. Matthew and Luke, on the other hand, are polished. They use better grammar. They smooth out all that awkward phrasing.
So if Matthew wrote first, this beautiful, polished masterpiece, it makes zero sense for Mark to come along later and say, you know what, I'm going to make this shorter, delete all the famous sermons, and completely ruin the grammar.
Precisely. Authors polish rough drafts. They don't rough and polish drafts. So the model is, Mark wrote the rough draft. Matthew and Luke had a copy of Mark's scroll open on their desks while they were writing.
So they followed his narrative, fixed his grammar, and then added their own extra material.
That's the theory.
Which brings us to the motivation. This is the part I found really compelling in the reading. Why write these down at all? You have these oral traditions, stories being told. Why the sudden urge to put ink to papyrus?
Panic. Pure and simple panic.
Really?
Yeah, you have to remember the mindset of the first generation of Christians. They were apocalyptic. They believed Jesus was coming back now.
Like next Tuesday, before the harvest is over.
Exactly. And if you think the world is ending in 6 months, you don't start writing a multi-volume history of your movement. You just tell people to get ready. You don't build libraries for the end of the world.
Right. Oral tradition is fine if you don't need the story to last past your own lifetime.
But then the clock kept ticking. We get to around 60 AD. It's been 30 years. The world hasn't ended, but you know what is ending.
The lives of the eyewitnesses.
The sources mention James, the brother of Jesus, gets martyred around this time. Peter's getting old. The leaders are dying.
And suddenly the community realizes, wait, if Peter dies and we haven't written down what he saw, we lose it forever.
That pressure created the Gospel of Mark. It was a race against memory loss.
That is a great transition to Mark himself. Who is this guy? Because if I'm strictly looking at the list of the 12 disciples, the inner circle Mark isn't on the roster.
No, he's not. And that's a detail that actually lends the text more credibility, oddly enough. Well, if you were forging a document later, you'd slap a famous name on it. You'd call it the Gospel of Jesus or the Gospel of Peter. You wouldn't call it the Gospel of this guy, Mark.
So who was he?
The sources paint him as a legitimate insider, just not a disciple. He was from a wealthy family in Jerusalem. His cousin or nephew, depending on the translation, was Barnabas, who was a huge deal in the early church.
Okay, so he's well-connected, he's got money, he's literate, but he wasn't there walking through the green fields with Jesus. So where does he get his information?
He had a boss. Mark was essentially the personal assistant and the translator for the apostle Peter.
Peter, the rock.
The fisherman.
The fisherman, and that's the key context. Peter was a Galilean laborer. His native language was Aramaic. He'd probably spoke enough Greek to sell fish, but he certainly didn't have the literary education to write a book that could circulate around the Roman Empire.
And Greek was the English of the ancient world, right? If you wanted your message to go viral, it had to be in Greek. Exactly. It was the language of commerce of the educated class. So Peter has the memories, but Mark has the pen. Mark becomes the ghostwriter.
That completely changes how you read Mark. You aren't reading a theology textbook, you're reading Peter's memories.
And you can feel Peter's personality in the text. Scholars point this out constantly. Mark is breathless. The most common word in the Gospel of Mark is euthus, which means immediately.
Immediately.
Immediately they went there. Immediately he healed him. It's action-oriented. It's urgent.
It's an action movie.
It is. It's Peter recounting the wildest 3 years of his life. He's not pausing to give you a long philosophical lecture. He's saying, look, you won't believe what happened next.
So we have Mark, essentially the Gospel of Peter, the rough, urgent eyewitness account. But then we have Matthew. Matthew picks up Mark's scroll, reads it, and says, okay, good start, but we're missing something huge.
The speeches.
Ah.
Mark is all action, very little dialogue. He tells you Jesus taught, but he doesn't record the sermons. He doesn't record the Sermon on the Mount.
Which is a problem. If you're trying to build a new religious movement based on those teachings, you need the manual.
Right. Now, Matthew was one of the 12, and his background is crucial. He was a tax collector.
Which in the ancient world usually meant traitor, but it also meant highly literate bureaucrat.
Exactly. He was an organizer. He knew how to keep records. He was likely fluent in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek. So Matthew takes Mark's narrative framework, the action beats, but he pauses the action to insert these massive blocks of teaching.
But here is where the detective story gets complicated again. We know Matthew used Mark because he copies the stories, but Matthew also has sayings of Jesus, famous ones that are not in Mark.
Right.
But Luke also has those same sayings, and they aren't in Mark either. So where did Matthew and Luke get them? Did they, collaborate?
This is the hypothesis of Q.
Q sounds like a character from a spy movie. Or Star Trek?
It stands for Quell, which is just German for source.
Okay.
It's the hypothetical lost notebook.
A lost notebook.
Scholars are almost certain that there was another document circulating in the early church, a list of Jesus' sayings, beatitudes, parables, no narrative, just quotes.
Like a best of quote book.
Exactly. Mark didn't have access to it, or he chose not to use it, but Matthew and Luke did. So when you see Matthew and Luke agreeing on a verse, word for word, and that verse isn't in Mark, scholars say that came from Q.
So picture Matthew at his desk.
Yeah.
He has Mark on his left for the action. He has this mysterious Q document on his right for the quotes, and then he has his own memories.
And he weaves them together. But Matthew has a very specific agenda. He is writing to a Jewish audience. He wants to prove that Jesus is the continuation of the Jewish story, not a break from it.
The sources mention he structures his book into 5 distinct sections. That feels intentional.
It is deeply intentional. 5 books of teaching. What does that remind you of?
The Torah, the 5 books of Moses.
Exactly. Matthew is presenting Jesus as the new Moses. He's saying, you like the old law, here's the new law. It's very systematic, very organized. It's the tax collector organizing the chaos of the movement into a handbook.
So Mark is the action hero, Matthew is the teacher. That brings us to our third investigator, Luke.
Luke is my personal favorite because he is so different from the other two. He is the wild card.
Well, for starters, he's not Jewish.
Correct. He is the only Gentile author in the entire Bible. He was a Greek physician, a doctor, and he was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul.
So he's an outsider. He's looking at this Jewish movement from the perspective of the broader Roman world.
And he approaches it like a scientist or a historian. He actually writes a preface at the beginning of his gospel. He basically says, hey, I know a lot of people have written about this, but I've investigated everything carefully from the beginning to give you an orderly account.
He's doing a deep dive.
He literally is. He's interviewing eyewitnesses. He's likely talking to Mary, the mother of Jesus, which is probably why Luke has so much more detail about the birth and Mary's perspective. But what's really interesting is what shocked him.
What do you mean?
As an outsider coming into this movement, there was one thing about the early Christians that Luke just could not get over. One thing that seemed to fascinate him more than anything else.
Well, what was it? The miracles? The resurrection?
It was the economics.
Really? The money?
The radical approach to money. You have to picture this. Luke is coming from the Roman system, which is built on patronage, hierarchy, status, accumulating wealth.
Right.
And then he meets this community of people who are selling their land, giving the cash to the apostles, and ensuring there isn't a single needy person among them.
That must have looked insane to a Roman.
It looked like a revolution. And that's why Luke's gospel talks about the poor, the marginalized, and money more than any other. He includes parables about wealth that the others leave out.
The Good Samaritan, the prodigal son. Those are exclusive to Luke. Right.
Exactly. Luke is obsessed with the social upheaval of the gospel. He isn't just asking, is this true? He's asking, how is this community functioning?
The source material made a really strong point about the context here.
Yeah.
This wasn't just a peaceful commune where everyone held hands in a field.
No.
This was happening under the threat of death.
Right. This is the part we often forget. By the time Luke is writing, or shortly after, persecution is ramping up. Christians aren't just social outcasts. They are enemies of the state. They end up living in catacombs, literal underground tunnels, for the better part of 3 centuries.
And yet, Luke is documenting that these people were joyfully giving up the only safety net they had, their money.
That's the investigator in Luke coming out. He's trying to explain to his audience, a guy named Theophilus, probably a wealthy Roman patron, why this movement is worth it. He's saying, look at these people. They are losing their lives. They're losing their property, and they are singing hymns in tunnels. Why?
That reframes the whole synoptic problem. It's not just about copying text. It's about 3 different authors addressing 3 different needs in a crisis.
Exactly. It's a stereo view. If you only had Mark, you'd have a great action story, but you wouldn't know much about the ethics. If you only had Matthew, you'd understand the Jewish law, but you might miss the global scope. If you only had Luke, you'd get the social justice, but you might miss the raw eyewitness urgency of Peter.
You need all 3 to triangulate the event.
And that's why the early church kept all 3. There were attempts to merge them into one mega gospel. It was called the Diatessaron, but the church rejected it. They said, no, we need the distinct voices.
I want to circle back to the word gospel itself before we wrap up, because we hear it so much. It just sounds like religious jargon, the gospel. But in the first century, that word evangelion, it wasn't a religious word at all, was it?
No, it was a political word. It was military propaganda. If the Roman emperor won a great battle, or if a new heir to the throne was born, imperial messengers would run to the cities shouting, Evangelion.
Good news.
Good news, it meant.
The world has changed. There is a new power in charge.
Exactly. So when Mark opens his book with the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, he is picking a fight. He is co-opting the emperor's language. He's saying, you think Caesar's the good news? No, this Galilean carpenter is the good news.
And based on what we see in Luke, It was news that was considered valuable enough to trade your life for.
That is the crux of it. The synoptic problem starts as this little literary puzzle counting words, checking grammar. But it ends as an existential confrontation. These writers weren't just bored historians, they were documenting something they believed was more real and more valuable than the Roman Empire itself.
It's heavy when you think about it. We've gone from who copied whom to what is worth dying for.
And that's usually where good scholarship leads. You pull on the thread of a Greek verb, and you end up staring at the human condition. The fact that we have 3 versions proves that one version wasn't enough to contain the impact of this event.
They needed the action, the sermon, and the social justice to get the full picture.
That's it. It's a detective story where the victim comes back to life, and the witnesses can't stop talking about it, even if it kills them.
And the investigators, Luke, Matthew, Mark, each compile their dossiers to make sure the world doesn't forget. So here is a final thought to chew on. We talked about Luke investigating the radical generosity of the early church, that willingness to treat material wealth as something to be given away, not hoarded. Luke looked at that and saw good news.
It raises a difficult mirror to hold up.
If Luke were dropped into the modern world today, let's say we hired him to write a deep dive on our society, or even specifically on our modern religious institutions, would he recognize the subject matter?
That is the uncomfortable question.
Would he find a community living with that same radical disregard for safety and property because the news is just that good? Or has the definition of good news shifted over the last 2,000 years from, sacrifice to safety?
I think Luke would have a lot of hard questions for us.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this investigation. Keep digging, keep reading, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.